the third video in the MOO Programming tutorial series that I'm doing. This video we're going to talk about properties, or object properties, and how to use them, what they're for, and how to use them in your code. So every object, pretty much, has properties. Its properties are either defined on it or its parents. So if I do properties me, I have no properties. But if I were to do @prop me.test and set it to 1, and then do properties me, I have a property called test. And I can do @show me.test, and the value is 1. Properties can hold any value that is valid in MOO. So that's a list, a string, an integer, an error, I believe. Let's see. @set me, once you've already created a property, so when you create a property, you can either create it with no value, or you can give it a default value. So @prop me dot property name, and then the default value. If you want to set a property after it's been created, you can use @set me.test. Let's try enone. I'm sorry, to enone. And then @show me.test, and it's set to enone. Let's set it to an empty list. Empty list. You'll also notice these permissions. This is read and see. See means that so every property has an owner, right? I'm the owner of this property that I created. If I create a property on another object, I will also be the owner. If the property is RW, that means that anyone else can set that property's value. If the property is just R, it means that only I can set the property, or another wizard, so somebody with the highest level of power. But if I was just a measly programmer, and I tried to edit a property created by a wizard that was only R, I would not be able to. I would get a permission denied error, eperm. But there are plenty of times where you want a property to not be owned by the person who originally created it, but by the owner of an object itself. So if you were to add the +C permission on a property, it means that it will be owned by whoever the owner of the object is. So you can do @shown. This is very similar to like Linux style or Unix style ownership. If I were to do @shown number2.test to, let's see, it's got to be a person to hacker, it will tell me that the +C property owner is set. Do I really want to do that? What this means is that, hey, if I chown this property to someone else, it kind of messes things up because the owner of the property is supposed to be the person who owns the object. Now let's look at my test object. Let's set a property on the test object. So @prop test.tester. Property added with 0. And then let's show test.tester. If I chmod test.tester -c and then show it again, I'm still the owner, but I can then chown test.tester to hacker. Now if I look again, hacker is the owner of it. And if I try to set number97.tester, this is another way to set. I'm evaluating the property. Just like I can, from a verb, I could set a property's value. From the command line, I can set a property's value. Now, it let me do this because I am a wizard, which is the most powerful Lambda MOO person, right? But if I was not a wizard, I could not do this. It would tell me permission denied. So, we now know how to create properties. How about how to remove them? @rmprop me.test. Property removed. I check my properties, and I have none. So at add prop, at remove prop, help at add prop, at list me at add prop. Sorry, I'm typing it incorrectly. Add prop. Oh my gosh, it's at prop. Okay, help at prop. So, help at property. This tells me some interesting things about how to do it. You can also, with at property or at prop, set an initial value and then the permissions. So if you didn't want it to be plus C, you could do minus C. You can also set who the owner of the property is going to be. So let's extend our debugger in a way that will allow us to turn debugging on and off globally. So I type just I, to see I have the debugger object on me, right? Let's add a property on debugger called enabled, and let's set the value to 1, right? We could also minus C it, minus W it, or minus CW, and set the owner to hacker. Now let's show debugger.enabled. Hacker is the owner, it's plus R, and the value is 1. Something to keep in mind with your code, it will run with the permissions of the person who is executing it, right? I'm sorry, the permissions of the person who created the verb. So as I'm a wizard, I can do pretty much anything. If you're just a measly player and you knew a verb that I coded that you could somehow access, then you would be able to run that verb with your permissions. So it's very important to be careful of permissions issues and to test those things, right? Players are not always the most trustworthy. Some of them can be malicious, so be very careful with the verbs that you add. Something you can do to update the permissions is do set task perms player. So what this will do is set the permissions that the verb is running with to the person who is executing the verb. Now there are cases where this doesn't work, where when you suspend, when you use a sin or suspend if needed, which we'll talk about in a later video, to replenish the ticks. So be very aware of that. Set task perms player runs, if you fork the verb, then you may have to do this again. So we could do that, but we don't need to do that for this verb. Just be aware that that is possible. Now my verb will execute, and it will be able to set this permission if I wanted it to. So I could do number98.enabled equals 0, right? My verb has been programmed. I call debugger critical, ASDF. And then if I show debugger enabled, it's now set to 0. Now, again, because I'm a wizard, the MOO is not going to tell me no very often. But a lower level player might get told no, a lower level bit, as we're calling them. So this is a wizard bit. A player bit might be a child of Fran's player class, but not a child of number 58 or 57. So they would have less permissions. But we don't actually want this to be set to 0. So we're going to evaluate number98.enabled equals 1. So we've now set that value. Again, I could have used at set number98.enabled to 0. Sets it. Set it to 1. So those are two different ways you can set properties. What we really want to do is be able to disable this globally. So what we can do is if this.enabled return. So what we're doing here is saying if this is not enabled, so this will be a Boolean value, this evaluates to 1 or 0. So if it's 1, this will get banged to 0, right? Making this not true, so this will not get executed. But if our code checks enabled and it's set to 0, this code will just return and it will not execute any of this stuff. This is return early, return often, right? We're basically saying, now we could have written this a different way. We could have done this. Right? But the problem with this way of doing things is that when you have a lot of these if statements, you end up with spaghetti code, right? And you don't want spaghetti code. You want your code to be as easy to understand as possible. So it's important that you put, as a matter of style and practice, your checking at the top, if possible. Return out of this verb as early as possible. That way, if I look at this, I know that if debugging is disabled, it's not going to do anything. There are no comments in MOO, but you can simulate a comment by having just a string. So if debugging is disabled, fail. Right? We could also add a usage. Debugger critical any arguments equals, we'll just do it like that. Notify all programmers of the debugging info, right? So these will just get dropped when it's compiled. So feel free to add comments like that. That's how I do it. It's very useful. You should always comment your code. So let's try and debug something right now. Right? It worked because debugging is enabled. Let's disable debugging at set number 98.enabled to 0. Nothing happened. Look at that. Help eval. So another cool thing with eval is that it can tell you how long your code took to execute. Let's do @prog options -eval time. Oops, sorry, I want plus eval time. It took 6 ticks and 0 seconds. This will remain accurate as long as you're not using command utils, suspend if needed, or in your code, this. A suspend is going to stop execution of your program and then resume it a little bit later, which will allow it to replenish its ticks and not error out due to lack of ticks. So it's important that you recognize that if you do suspend, then your ticks, or your time and ticks, will both be a little off. Maybe your time will be fine, but your ticks will be messed up. So let's just do that. Suspend 1, ticks left. So you'll notice that was kind of weird, right? It's not doing what you would expect. So just keep that in mind. All right, so we've now turned on @prog options plus eval time, right? Just keep that for you guys and put it in the show notes. So let's take this a step further. We've now disabled debugging. Let's make a verb that'll allow us to toggle debugging on and off. So let's do @verb me, or let's put it on number 57. @verb number 57 @debug. None, 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 because it won't take any arguments, and rxd. And let's edit number 57 @debug. So what we're going to do here is say that the debugger.enabled equals bang debugger.enabled. I believe this will work to toggle it. And then we'll say player tell debugging toggled. We'll make this a little bit better in a second. At, what was that? At debug. Debugging toggled. So if we do at show debugging.enabled, debugger.enabled, it's 0. Then we do at debug, and we at show it, it's set to 1, right? So a better way to do this would be to say what it's been toggled to, right? And for that, in MOO, if you're familiar with ternary statements, the MOO does have a ternary statement. It's slightly different format than what you might expect. So we could do me.tell, let's do a equals debugging.enabled question mark debugging question mark on, and then instead of an exclamation point like you might expect, it's a pipe, right? Debugger on. Now if we toggle debugging off, right? So let's take that and let's put it into our code. Debugging toggled to, and then we'll do a plus, and we'll do that. Now, let's see how that works. At debug, type mismatch. Why did we get a type mismatch? Well, let's see if that works. There we go. So you can't just put $enabled because of the way that the MOO is going to parse it. You've got to consider the order of operations. So when you encounter something like that, make sure that you're putting parentheses around this to let the MOO know that it should evaluate this entire statement before trying to do the concatenation, right? Because it's going to treat the concatenation, it's going to treat it like this if there's no parentheses. It's going to try to evaluate that from left to right, then the question mark, then the on, and it's going to find that the question mark doesn't make sense. So putting the parentheses around it will tell it that it needs to evaluate what's inside these parentheses before it tries to evaluate the concatenation. Now another thing we can do is make it a little bit more punctual by adding that. So now we can do at debug, and at debugging is on. And then we can do debugging, debugger, critical, test. Right? Now, we don't actually want all these tick things, so we're going to get rid of them and just do that. So now when we evaluate, we just get test. But let's add a bit more formatting here. Let's say literal equals to literal, and then we're going to say debug info plus to literal. That's a bit easier to read right there, right? So now if we're looking, if we need to control F for some specific debug information, we can do that. There's also callers. Callers is going to give you some very specific information about who called the verb. So what if we just debugged out some caller information? So let's see, how can we do this the best way? Args, callers, caller. It's just caller. No? Oh. There we go. All right. So let's see how this works. Incorrect number of arguments to critical. Sorry, we'll have to call caller like that. All right, so the caller was number -1. Not what I was expecting. So let's change that to object caller. Type mismatch. Okay, well, if we just do caller. Type mismatch again. All right, forget that. We'll do 2 literal callers. Let's see, help callers. Returns information on each of the verbs and built-in functions currently waiting to resume execution in the current task. So what this should allow us to do is get who called this verb. So it was called from the command line. And there's some other information. Now we have a put verb, right? At list tester put. Let's test put. All right, so let's call number 97. Oh, let's just call put. Put ASDF in test. So now you'll see that we get information on who called this. We got the caller is number 97, the put verb called by number 2, calling number 97, calling number 2. I don't know the exact little details of that, but this will give you the information. The current object, the verb, the programmer, the verb location, the player, and the line number, right? Very interesting information. So let's do callers. Like that. Forgot some concatenation. Make this a little bigger for you. So now we've got a little bit more information about where this was called. This can be very important when you're leaving debug information in your script for later times to try to test things out, or to try to capture specific runtime information. So we haven't really done, you've seen a couple times that I've gotten these tracebacks, right? A traceback is going to execute on the person who executed a verb. So anyone who calls the put method on my test object, if there is a traceback, they will see this, right? This is the information they will see. Now, if they don't report that information to you, you might not know that there was an error. So putting try catches in your code and having your debugger push that debug information out to a channel that you've created that all the programmers can see is a good way to, at the very least, I lost my connection. It's a good way, at the very least, to make yourself aware that certain debugging has happened. You could, for instance, create a wrapper for the file utilities. You'd have to have file utilities, a file utilities plugin running, or I'm sorry, server patch running. But you could make it so that your errors get logged to a specific file that you can grep through later on. So that's properties, or a basic intro to properties and some improvements on our debugger. See you in the next video. If you like this one, add comments with questions. I'm happy to answer them, and happy mooing.